Hola, mi nombre es Alejandro, ella es mi esposa Zaira. Nosotros hemos asistido a Iglesia Zona Río aproximadamente, ya tenemos unos 7 meses. Ahorita, en este momento, nos encontramos sirviendo con los jóvenes y con los niños.
Estamos emocionados y sobre todo comprometidos con esa iniciativa de POR, porque sé que a través de nuestra generosidad, nuestro tiempo, nuestros talentos, vamos a traer un crecimiento, una transformación, tanto en California como en Baja California.
Nosotros damos fielmente para este movimiento porque sabemos que habrá una plantación de iglesias en California y en Baja California. En iglesias como Zona Río, a las que nosotros pertenecemos, hemos visto un impacto en nuestra comunidad.
Cada 15 días vamos y servimos a personas en situación de calle, visitamos a personas en centros de rehabilitación y les llevamos alimento físico, pero también un mensaje de esperanza.
It's been really amazing partnering with Fito and his community at Zona Rio. 4 weeks ago, we were, as pastors, down at their church and just prayerfully kind of preparing for all that was going to happen through this series. We knew it was a big, kind of monumental moment for their church as they made major headway into all of these high-impact neighborhoods. They've been serving like kind of the kids in their community for a long time, really faithfully, but this series, this 4 series, the 5 weeks that we had planned on going together into the communities that we're close to by way of service projects, that community was on the receiving end of all of our churches by way of like partnership, and they continue to do so. So we marked out, if you've been with us, we said we were going to do a 5-week series around this idea of what we are for. We're in week 4 of a 5-week series in 4, not shorter than 4 minutes, but we will definitely be continuing in like this theme all year long as we move into 2024. I know, it's really bad. So we didn't really think about how bad it was going to sound, but now we're just in it, and we're like, now we committed, we made shirts, so whatever. The bottom line, though, is that we are coming to the tail end of the year that we've spent in pursuit of the ways of Jesus that we've been chasing in the New Testament. We've been literally going through the 50-ish commandments of Jesus where he says, if you want to be in pursuit of me, here's what it's going to look like. And he gives like these really challenging, really clarifying, very motivational kind of calls to action about how we ought to live and posture and position ourselves in life. And they've been so good, but at the end of this run, as Jesus makes his way towards the end of his ministry before he goes to the cross, the clarity by which Jesus is describing who he is for is unmistakable. And last week, we began a conversation about Jesus being invited to a Pharisee's home for dinner. And that Pharisee is kind of representation of the religious elite. They would have been the most turned up, staunch individuals. It would have been hard to get an invitation to this dinner. So it's interesting that Jesus is on the list because Jesus has been so openly public about his frustration with how they have really restricted people from having access to the good news, access to the gospel. The Pharisees have made it very difficult for the poor, the non-Jewish, birthright and born individuals. They made it very difficult for them to believe that there would be a good God out there who would have a plan for them also. That's why Jesus spends so much time speaking and sending so much of his ministry career is spent talking to those that are on the fringes. That's where we get the Beatitudes and him saying like, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Guess what? Anybody feel like they're bankrupt right now in soul? I have good news for you. Blessed are the brokenhearted, people who are feeling a sense of dismay relationally because either by your choice or not by your choice or what has happened to you or what happened through you, you might feel like your life is now relationally over, but I promise you there's a blessing to be had right where you are if you can turn your sights to me. This has been Jesus' narrative. All the while to the religious elite, Jesus has been very strict saying, you are not being You are not being a people by which God first chose you. Your grandfathers, they lived in the grace of God's provisions, but now you've made this an elitist experience, and you're blocking others from experiencing the rich goodness of grace that I, in person, Jesus, have for them in real time right now. This is kind of the context of where we have found ourselves. And Jesus at this dinner has been having like a very tense talk. Last week we talked about Jesus commanding the host of the dinner. He's saying, you need to be keen on who you continue to associate with, because there's a blessing found in expanding kind of your comfort circles, who you socialize with. You'll know with great clarity what the payout is going to be if you bring your friends to the table and people who can do good things for you, or people who are wealthy into your circle. That's what Jesus said. There's a direct understanding of what that's going to get you, but there's a blessing to be had if you work in rhythm with me and we find ourselves expanding the circles by which we occupy, that we make room for people who don't necessarily fit in culturally, socially, economically. And in that, it's very representative of God's heavenly kingdom, that there's room for everyone if they submit themselves to the ways of Jesus. That's kind of where Jesus was aiming at when he was talking to the host last week. This week we're in the same chapter, and as Jesus is kind of pressing in full court on the people who feel like the insiders, the elitists, there's somebody in this story who's going to try to break the tension by kind of just throwing something out there. There are some brave individual souls that are like this. When it's real tense, they'll say something like, whoa, did you see the Chargers last week? Man, that was crazy. All right, they just try to insert themselves in some way to kind of break the rhythm of tension. This happens literally in this story. Somebody's going to kind of put a statement out there, and Jesus will not relent. Jesus keeps the gas pedal down when it comes to what he's trying to convey. And Jesus is going to tell a story about people who make excuses for why they wouldn't necessarily show up when it's time to really show your true colors. And it made me think, there are plenty of times in my life when I've been invited to something, but at first sight, I was really excited. Yes, I'll be there. It's easy to say yes, but then as it comes critically close to the date of the thing, then you're like, I actually don't want to be there. And so you just lob up an excuse. Usually it's not true. Anybody? You're like, whatever your answer is. Last service, I asked the question, real time in the room, what's the best lie you've ever told in trying to get out of something? And I just opened it up to the room, and it was chaos. This service is so much holier than that service. So I'm just gonna offer it out to you. What have you ever said to get out of a prior yes, where you committed to being somewhere, but then you decided at the last minute that you didn't? Whether it was like a date or work or school, have you ever just flat out lied and said, I can't because fill in the blank? Kids are sick. That was a common one. Last one, just throw your kids under the bus. I get that one. Then they see on social media your kids are like, yay, right? And they're like, any others in the room courageously willing to say what they've lied about to get out of something? Yes? Previously engaged. Not like this kind of engaged, but I forget that I had prior plans, right? That's pretty soft. I appreciate that one. Nobody's going to be like, show me your calendar, please, right? Unless it's your mom, and then your mom is she calls you, she check bluffs you. Any other good liars in the room? Any other good liars in the room? Under the weather, nobody's going to fight you, especially since the pandemic, right? They're like, no, please, please, please. There's got to be more ruthless answers than this. Have you ever given just a really good one? Anybody? So weak. That's so weak. That's so weak. I was reading on Reddit, they said that somebody said that they accidentally got on a plane to Cancun as an excuse for why they couldn't get to work. And I was like, you can't do that. Nobody just accidentally, one, gets on a plane, two, to Cancun. Go to Minnesota in the winter. That's the real excuse. Last service, absolute sinners, chaos. Somebody in the middle of the room yelled explosive diarrhea. Go and watch the tape. Watch the freaking tape at 9. I was like, everybody knows you now. Everybody knows you. Jesus is going to tell a story of an invitation, and he's going to list out all these excuses that people would give metaphorically for not being able to come to a banquet. And he's gonna give that storyline to the person that's trying to cut the tension. And so here's what this tells me. One, Jesus is okay with tension. That's like number one observation out of this before I even read the text. Jesus is good with it being awkward in the room, especially at this point in Scripture, because he has been telling people, I am here to disrupt what you think the religious status quo is. Actually, if you are highly religious, we're going to have a lot of issues because I'm not here for religion. I'm here to actually fulfill the law. But what that's going to do is it's going to make way more room for way more people than even you or me are comfortable with when it comes to who's going to be in and then who's going to be considered out. And so the rebels in the room are like, yeah, bring them in, Jesus. I love it. The people who are like the planners and the people who love stability, the people who need to make sure there's a checklist and there's a guest, they're really freaking out at this point because it is so disruptive in this first century as Jesus keeps telling people every time he stands on a mountaintop, he's like, you too, you also, I see you, I want you to experience fullness. Doubters, skeptics, openly known rebels, sinners, cheaters, liars, criminals. He's literally dishing out tickets I want you to know that I see you as light. You remember that conversation? Huge potential statement over them. You don't feel like you're somebody who's luminous and virtuous, but I'm telling you, when I go to the cross, I will make you luminous. I will cover you, and the only way God will see you is through my sacrifice. So how you see yourself is irrelevant, because if you surrender to me, God only sees perfection. He is dishing that good news out, shoveling it out on people. And the religious elite who have been trying to keep the doors tight and closed, who are frustrated that they've been following kind of this Mosaic law for generations, they don't like the idea that somebody's just flinging the doors open for people who have not spent any time being disciplined. Last week we were showing the ladder, right? And how the ladder, the Pharisees would have been removing rungs of the ladder, making it difficult for people to make their way up and in. Circumcision, they're like, we'll get them there. Jesus is like, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not. Everybody has access if they have faith in me. Somebody tries to cut the tension here, Luke 14. One of the men sitting at the table with Jesus heard these things. Expand your circle, consider your seat. And the man said to him, Jesus, it'll be a great blessing for anyone to eat a meal in God's kingdom. He's literally saying, Jesus, we hear you. All of us who are here, it's going to be great when we get to do this in glory. Considering who's at the table. This person is at the table. He's not an insider. He is an insider. He would have had some social or economic value to bring to the host by reputation and proximity. So the guy at the table is like, it's going to be epic when we're all together in glory. I mean, we're insiders here. We're for sure going to be insiders there. And Jesus is like, pump the brakes, bro. He goes right in on him, and he goes, I got a story for you. Consider this. It says to him, a man gave a big dinner. He invited many people. And when it was time to eat, he sent his servants to tell the guests, come, the food is ready. But all of the guests said that they could not come. Each one made an excuse. The first one said, I have just bought a field, so I must go look at it. Please excuse me. Another man said, I've just bought 5 pairs of work animals. I must go try them out. Please excuse me. And the third man said, I just got married. I can't come. So the servant returned, and he told his master what happened, and the master was angry. And he said, hurry, go into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring me the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. We'll stop just right there in the story. So, person at the table, It's going to be awesome when we're all doing this, but like in our heavenly bodies, like when we're the insiders here, we'll be the insiders there. Jesus goes, hey, can I tell you a story? What if there was a host who was throwing a dinner much like this? And then when all the people who were invited on the list had some reason, some excuse to not come, that host was so frustrated at the cost of assembling such a spread that he sent his servant to go past the invitees and to go and invite anybody who would be willing to come, but particularly the people who were the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Now, if you're on the receiving end of that story as Jesus is telling it to you, you're like, those people wouldn't be caught dead in here. Like, those people we already know by religious kind of like history, if you are any one of those like ailments, you would have been seen as like religiously flawed. There was something that happened in your family, something that happened in your life early on that God had cursed you, so then you would have had either economic like depravity, you would have been crippled in some way, shape, or form by like an ailment or an extremity, blind, not being able to see, or like general being immobile, an invalid. And they would have never in a million years, nobody would have even thought that they would have or could have ended up at a banquet meal. And Jesus is like, what if that host, in all of his audacity, because he was so frustrated with who he had initially invited, just goes and gets like the worst, the farthest, nobody would expect them to be in? What if those people occupied the dinner table? He's saying this to a person at the table. And I literally think Jesus is like, I'm here to ruin your party because you've been ruining this party for so many people for so long. He's like, what if I did that? What if this host did that? You know who the host is, right? Get ready. It's coming. This is how Jesus is like pressing people so elitist in who they will and won't associate time with. He continues the story. He's not done with it. He goes, later, the servant said to him, Master, I did what you told me, but we still have places for more people. He says, so the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and the country roads and tell the people there to come. I want my house to be full. Then Jesus, finishing the story, direct line, says, I tell you, not one of those people I invited first will eat any of the food I prepared. This story is so significant for you and for me for one reason. If you are not born Jewish by birthright, this was the declaration at a dinner table that Jesus is saying, I am making room for more than just the Israelite birthright, original people that were found in the Old Testament. There's like a group of nomadic individuals known as the Israelites. They are God's chosen people. He walks with them while they have no king and they have no leader all through the Old Testament. This is his hand over those people. Then those people, as more tribes come into fruition by like the population of the earth, those tribes who don't worship or know God, they put in place for themselves kings, leadership. This is where we get through the Old Testament. God's people who have God as their king and Lord, they get real like FOMO about not having a person to sit on a throne, somebody to crown. So they crown kings as an act of rebellion and distrust in a holy God who has been guiding them their entire existence. Right? This is who the Jewish people come out of by birthright. Now, at this point in this book of Luke, God has been making provision for those people, but they have become so self-centered in them being God's chosen people that they have literally created as many barriers as you could imagine for anybody who wasn't birthright born that way, that they are now, this is where Jesus is coming in and saying, you're blocking people out of heaven. You're blocking people away from the good news. And it can't be this way. I came so every single person might be able to hear and accept the good news that I am for them. That's where we get this for idea from. This is the meal where Jesus is articulating to insiders, there will no longer be an inside. My grace will go farther than you could ever comprehend to people that you'll never imagine will have faith and follow me. And he's saying it as a warning. He's saying it as as almost like a rebuke to people who continue to just have their identity fulfilled at being at the table, that they keep throwing these things for themselves and, oh, you're here? How fantastic. Let's enjoy ourselves and what we can earn and enjoy for ourselves. And Jesus goes, somebody's going to regret inviting me to this like dinner party, because I'm telling you all, it's not going to be like this forever. The minute I go to the cross, everybody's in if they declare their faith in me. The Gentile, not born Jewish, the nationalities that will stem and come from all of these first century churches, if they see and understand who I am and what I'm calling them to do, they have a seat at my Father's table. It's a liberating truth that Jesus is putting on the table here. It's so important. And so coming out of this, I just wanted to be keen on some of the things that we can pull out of it, because it's so important for us to understand that we're afforded a seat in God's table, but we also have been given a role and a purpose to play in this kind of macro story. So things that Jesus teaches me through this story. The first is that Jesus is going to teach us that admittance into God's kingdom requires my active response to his invitation. This is why he's using this illustration of people who were invited, who said yes, but then later when the servant came knocking on the door, they had a reason not to go. In the first century, this would have been like the way that you do like an RSVP to a party, or like a save the date. A host would have said, on this, like in this month, at this time of the year, we're going to have a huge feast, a festival. Our family's going to plan it. Our family's going to throw it. And we'd love to know if you're going to be there. It's too difficult in the first century to say, it's going to be on Thursday at 6 o'clock. Please arrive by 5:30, right? It's like meals don't work that easy in the first century. So the rhythm is, you know you're invited. And then what happens is when it comes time for the meal to be served and prepared, plated, ready, the host would send a servant to families that live in multi-family, single-housed units, and they would go, tell the neighbors the meal is ready. And so a servant would be sent, which is what Jesus uses the illustration, knocking on the doors. Now's the time to make good on it. You said yes before, but now it's the active, like, come to the table, be in proximity. There's been much spent for your arrival. And Jesus says each one of the people who previously said yes came to the table not with their presence, but with a fantastic excuse. You are afforded a seat at God's table. You realize that. But it requires your active response to show up. And trust me, it's way broader than coming to church. Coming to church is like the blessing of getting to see other people in pursuit of that call, but we're all flawed. Obviously, you all gave up your worst lies to get out of work. Church is just a small bubble of what it looks like to be in like this grand rhythm of life in pursuit of Jesus. But each one of us are afforded an invitation, but you have to play your active part in it. Your response, your yes doesn't just say yes here. Oh, I get it. There's a God and he probably has something for me, but it requires work here and here and here, that you would play your part in whatever way he's gifted you. Number two, it shows us that there are plenty of excuses that can keep us from prioritizing God's kingdom. Jesus is using real-time examples, and he's no dummy. So I know that Jesus in the room is reading the priorities of the people at the table because everybody's in earshot of him. He's talking to one, but he knows many are listening, and he uses these examples. He says, the first one said, I just bought a field, so I've got to go look at it. I'd say that looks like materialism, right? He's going like, I got a lot of things, Jesus, that I got to manage, and it's going to be tough for me to kind of show up to that thing that you're calling me to. You get it, though, because it's your blessing that's given me so much, right? And I think it's important to know of the things that I'm going to list in the next, 5 minutes, none of these things in and of themselves are sin. They're not things that God says, ooh, don't do that, don't have that. But Jesus is very keen through Scripture about his desire for things to have a priority, right? So he says, I want you to prioritize my call on your life, the way I'm asking you to be in pursuit of me, and I want you to see through that priority lens to the things that I'm blessing you with. So, if you have material things, how through the lens of God's provision and grace and goodness do you steward those things? Not the other way around. Oh, God, I've just got so many things that are kind of occupying my attention and finances and like all that I am right now. It's just hard to see and find time for you. See the difference in this priority versus God, I want to see through you how I steward the things that you've given me ownership over. That's the first one, materialism. The second one, I think, is busyness, right? He says, the second person, I just bought 5 pairs of working animals. I got to go try them out. He doesn't say like, oh, I got some things. He's like putting a numeric thing on it. There's a lot of like things that are going to take much of my time. It's so important to understand in the idea, the concept of time, like we don't find time. You realize that. Whenever you have like good intention with somebody to get together, you go, let's find time. You know you're saying that like in vain. You'll never find it. What do you have to do? You have to make it. You have to make time. You have to prioritize the time in order to fulfill whatever it is you desire, right? So Jesus uses this example of busyness, and he's like, whoever you are at the table who think that by like your position and how demanded upon you are and just how involved you are, that's going to kind of set a precedent. God's going to understand because clearly you're managing so much. He's like, it's a big excuse and I'm getting frustrated with it. Is the illustration Jesus is bringing to the table. That there's been a sacrifice made. That person who sacrifices is Jesus. He wants you to be there, but the time by which you find yourself in proximity to him, in relationship, worshiping him, serving him, being clear about his call on your life, you go, there's just so much, like I have to look through the lens of my busyness, and if I can catch something that lines us up, maybe I got an hour this week, maybe. He's like, you're going to miss the kingdom if you let busyness be your first lens. And then lastly, the guy who's like, oh, I just got married, he like totally throws his spouse under the bus, right? He's like, my wife won't let me. Family is another good one. And then you're like, whoa, Mingo, like you're like family? But here's where I know this can be totally dead on, right? There are some of us who are in relationships where those relationships, we prioritize the security of being in a human relationship versus trusting that God calling us to be in proximity to him. We go like, I can't sacrifice that even if this person doesn't want to go to church or be connected in a growth group or in pursuit of God in a daily Bible study. Like I'll choose security over sanctification, right? That the continuation process of being close and renewed to God. He's like, that's not a good excuse. There's been much sacrifice for your seats. That's not a good excuse. Some of us will say like, oh man, like kids are not, their games are scheduled on Sundays now, and like we just want them to have good sleep, and they're cranky, and we can't have, like, that sets us up for Monday. And a lot of times as our families become more complex, our reasons for not being connected become cheaply complex. And so I love that Jesus kind of puts it out there. Like that's how he could have used any 3 examples, and those are the 3 he uses. And so on the table, he's saying, I just want you to be prepared that there are things that are going to want to vie for your prioritization of my invitation to understanding your purpose, to understanding that you're loved, you're completely known, and you're completely loved. There's going to be things that are going to fight for your attention to play your active part in this much greater movement that God is drawing, reconciling people back to himself. He has a plan for you in that. And as he's sitting at a dinner with people who have made it very difficult for outsiders to feel like they're truly, genuinely invited in, he's saying, this is going to disrupt your humanity the most. And so here's like where we find ourselves in the narrative. I think that there are ways by which God in his kingdom, Jesus in his invitation will actually break down our boundaries that we put out there as like who's in and who's out, right? The first is God's kingdom will break down my economic boundaries, the things that I go like, there's no way, like this is a great community. Sometimes it's challenging if somebody comes in visibly and you're like, whoa, this person is really down and out. If they just like show up, but like, they can't ask anything. But Jesus is like, oh no, please ask. Like this is going to be a display, an opportunity for my people to show how generous they actually are. And then everyone's like, well, I mean, do you have a track record? Is there like, can we see some evidence of your like spending history, right? We love to put qualifiers in on our generosity. And Jesus is like, the poorest of the poor, go get those in my story. The ones who can't afford to live in town, the people who live east of the 15, me, make sure they're on the invite list. They got to know they're in. They got to know that I've got a seat with their name on it. He will challenge your economic boundaries for who you think play the most significant part in the storyline of God's goodness. He's going to challenge your social boundaries. That's what I love about this church. Like, man, there are so many different social statuses when it comes to who comes to this place to hear and celebrate the person of Jesus. There are lawyers and there are flunkies out of high school. There are people who are business owners. There are people who hate working for business. There are people who despise driving cars that are not electric in this room. There are other people who will only drive a diesel engine, right? I love it. It's like polluters and activists all the same. All of our economic standards and preferences, all of our social standards and preferences, they're all submitted. They're secondary to the prioritization of the person of Christ. You hear me, right? And then lastly, this cultural boundary. This is probably the most prominent in this moment with so much happening around the world. We're thinking like this culture, not that culture, those people, not this people. Grace here, no way grace is going there. Jesus is like, I got news for you. I will invade any open heart at any moment with the right clarity of who they're submitting themselves to. And it's going to challenge the crap out of you. But that's okay. That's why I'm God and you're not. And so, I want this to weigh heavy on us because it takes us places that we wouldn't naturally go in our humanity. It asks us specifically, consider my part in the invitation and in the responsibility to invite others into God's kingdom. That's the going kind of takeaway out of all of this is that Jesus is telling a story, and the best part about stories are the characters. And in the characters, Jesus is like, go ahead and pick your player. That's like the best part of Jesus' stories. Bible historians and studiers, they go like, don't you dare put yourself in the story. But like stories are told so that you would have a link to one of the characters. And the beauty is you should find yourself at any point in any of the characters -1. Do you know which storyline character you cannot be? You can't be the host. You know who the host is? It's God. And if you're like, oh, but I kind of feel like the host, I'm like, oh, you're in the right spot, you narcissist. You belong here, right? You're not the host. The host has made great sacrifice, life on a cross. That is the host's spot. He says, there are some of you who need to consider your spot, that you've taken a priority seat because how long you've been in this rhythm of religion. Consider some humility. Take a seat back, make space. There are some others of you, you don't think that you're an insider, but I promise you, Jesus has his attention on you. He sees the development that's happening in your heart. He sees you wrestling. He sees you fighting, wondering, doubting, having faith, tiny little bits, but it's growing. You're watering it. You're in community. He goes, I got my eyes on you. There's a seat at the table for you. He sees the people that are way off, way over here. You don't even see them. Their storyline in their mind hasn't even started. God is nowhere to be found, and he's like, watch what I do. I have your name at the table, I promise you. But would you be faithful to play your part and how God is going to use you like the servant to be sent out to go tell people, he's so good, he has your name on a plate at the table. You wouldn't believe it. I promise you there's a spot for you. There's a spot for me. That's why I know there's a spot for you, because I'm really good at lying and going to work. And he has a spot for me. Here's what this looks like tangibly. For the last 4 weeks, we've been talking about this idea of defining like what our part is going to be in the year to come. And if you're new to the church, here's what I'm so thankful for. You get like written documentation in this like program of all the things that our church is for. Programs like the Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition, right, where we're helping like fight human trafficking right across our own borders, right up through like the San Ysidro border. That's 100% funded by our church movement. The ways by which we care for first responders, doing family counseling and peer support training for every firefighter, every policeman, every paramedic. It happens in real time here in this room every single week by counselors in partnership with the city. That's what we're for. And in the year to come, we're asking everybody who calls this church home to play their part in the bigger story. We're asking you to do it with your time. We're asking you to do it with some portion of your finances. And I just want to be really clear. Next week is like the final 5th week. We're going to ask everybody to play some part in this larger narrative, whether that's serving, whether it's giving, whether it's faithfully attending. But we're asking you to prayerfully say, God, what would be my part? And not to be like, oh, he just wants me to come. He wants so much more for you just to have a seat. And so we're asking you to prayerfully consider what 2 things are. First, our Christmas offering every year we take as like a fund to deploy when there's tragedy or need in the nation. We've given to every major hurricane. We've given to every major economic disruptor that's happened, as much as we're able to with a bucket that we collect at the end of the year. We use it in the year to come. We only have $8,000 left in that bucket coming into the end of the year. We're pushing that money towards all this devastation that's happening in Baja right now with the hurricane that rolled through there. We're deploying funds through Convoy of Hope. When Maui was burning, we gave it to 2 churches so that they could rebuild and have a place to worship, so they could tell people Jesus has not left your family alone and deserted. We're asking you to consider what your Christmas offering is going to be in the month to come, and then what your collective generosity might look like in a year's time. That you would take 12 months, consider what your gift would be for those 12 months, and then put that collective number on a paper. What that will do for our community is help us set up the community efforts that we're for as an organization to pave the way so we could tell them, here's how we're going to be with you and for you in the year to come. Here's how our churches can guarantee that kids ministry will be funded, young adult ministry, women's ministry, anything that we're doing to serve the neighborhood, we will be a reliable source of hope in the year to come. We're asking you to plan that out with us. Fallon and I are doing it. Our whole staff is doing it. All the leaders in our church, they're committing to doing it, and we're asking that you would commit to doing it also. And then next week, we're going to put those numbers together, and then we'll know, okay, Lord, this is how we are prayerfully planning to be with you in partnership with the ministry that you're going to do in the year to come. It will be how we responsibly play our part in God's kingdom as he gives us opportunity for 12 months going into next year. It's a lot, but I think it's the right response to 52 weeks of looking at the ways of Jesus. Now we go into 52 weeks of how we act and move in his name, for his name's sake. I want to pray for us, and then I'm going to invite the band in. And here's what I want you to do. If this is news to you, if you're like, whoa, I've never even heard this before, or you're like, Mingo, I've been to other churches and they're trying to do this, I want you to stop and just ask, God, what's my part in this? Maybe you're here as a household and you go, God, what's our part in this? And I have absolute faith that whatever he gives you as an answer, if you're faithful to that answer, we will do everything that he wants us to do. But my hope is that we've all been compelled to our part, that there's 100% participation in the room regarding our Lord, what would you have for us? I want everybody to ask that question. So let me pray. The band is going to close with a song, and then next week I'm asking, would you be prepared to join us as we, with all 8 of our congregations, thousands of individuals are going to be prayerfully asking this one thing: God, what would you have for me? How would you work through us to impact our churches, our communities, California and Baja California. Lord, my prayer is that we would first just rest in this magnificent reality that you have made room for us. And how much favor rests in you making space at your Father's heavenly table for us, Lord. There are so many of us that wonder if that seat is real, if you intentionally see us. And Lord, I just cannot deny Scripture as Jesus calls for every person on the streets and in the faraway places and in the unknown spaces, Lord. Anybody, anywhere who calls on your name, you promise has a seat in your family at your Father's table. So, Lord, would you receive our faithful yes? Would we be filled with your Spirit? And then, Lord, would you show us what our part looks like in this small moment amongst so many people gathered globally, Lord, in your name. Would you meet us in a real way as we worship you, Jesus? We love you. Amen.